Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Julie Shields Rutina, and I am the Director of College Planning and Education at MEFA. And tonight you are joining us here for the college financing webinar, a very popular topic this evening. So we're so glad that you could join us. Let me tell you that to the right of your screen, you should see a panel, and I have muted all of you just to make sure we keep the background noise down, but please, we want this to be interactive. We want to be able to answer your questions, so please feel free to type any questions you have in that panel, and we will get to them either throughout the presentation or near the end. And I keep saying we because we have a very special guest this evening, and with us to present, we have Jim Slattery, who is the Director of Financial Aid at Northeastern University. And Jim is an expert in all things financial aid and college financing, and has been working in this field for a very long time. And I know that you will learn so much from Jim tonight. Something else I'll share, and Jim, you can feel free to add all kinds of detail about your life, but one thing is that Jim and I also both have college students currently. So I share that to say that we are in this with you. So we've gone through this ourselves, and we really understand all of it from both a professional and a personal side. I'll say a couple more things about MEFA. So MEFA, many of you probably know us and some may not, but MEFA has been around since 1982, and we have some low-cost loan programs for families who need that type of financing to finance higher education. We also have the state's 2 college savings plans, the U Fund and the U Plan. And then everything else we do is about offering free guidance to families at every stage of this process, really from parents with babies to parents with college students and beyond. And so, of course, one big topic is this whole college financial aid application process, and that's what tonight's webinar is about. But please come back to MEFA often, and at mefa.org/events, you can see webinars on all kinds of topics all year long, and especially for students who are seniors and parents of seniors, we will continue topics having to do with helping you make a good decision in the spring and making sure that you can get to college and pay for it next year. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jim, and please enjoy the evening.
Thanks, Julie. Good evening, everyone. And I'm going to repeat it. I expect you in your homes, you're collectively in your homes. I think right now we have over 100 participants. I'm hoping you're saying, good evening, Jim. Good evening. Let me talk a little bit about housekeeping and introduce the program today. As Julie said, my name is Jim Slattery. I work at Northeastern University. I'm the Director of Financial Aid there. I've been around for a long time, which means mainly that I'm old, primarily in the financial aid space, but I've worked in admissions, and I worked for the College Board, the testing and also financial aid organization. I've worked for a lender at one point. All this means is that the experience is varied. If you fall asleep in your soft chairs tonight, none of my experience did you any good. But the hope is that you have that perspective. And as Julie mentioned, my perspective as a parent as well. I have a college student now, and so I've gone through this process a bit, and I'm still in the middle of the process. And if the Lord helps us, we'll be done the process in a couple of years. If you can't tell through my voice, I don't love this setup. My preference is to see you. My preference is to see how you're reacting, to see if I'm losing you, to get you to shake your head so that I know that you're understanding things. And I'm very wary of the fact that I cannot see you. I'm wary of the fact that you're in very soft seating. Some of you may be into the wine already, or perhaps you've eaten and you have full bellies. So I'm very wary of all this stuff. That's the downside. The upside is this program is recorded. You can go back to this later. You can review it later. You can go in and keep listening to my nasally voice over and over and over as many times as you'd like. There's a message in there. The message is this: we've reserved roughly an hour and a half to talk about the financial aid process. I'm going to go through a pretty detailed presentation. We're going to try to leave time for questions at the end. During the program, if you have questions, you have a way to pose questions during the session. Julie will be reviewing those. If your question gets ignored, please don't panic or be upset. It may be a timing piece. Julie has a sense of the session, and it may mean that your question will more appropriately follow later in the session, and she'll interrupt me. It may be we won't get to everyone's questions because we have a pretty big audience tonight, but we will try to get to as much high-level information as we can. The other point of my intro now in this lesson is don't presume you're going to walk away with all of the knowledge tonight. This is a dense topic. It can be a confusing and intimidating topic. It's something you may have to go back to several times, and it's something where you want to keep going back to experts. So don't just rely on our session. Take advantage of the resources that MEFA has to offer. Take advantage of your high school resources. Your guidance counselors, your school counselors are terrific resources. They have great information. They have great context. They're there to help you. And the final, most important piece I can leave you with, and I hope I remind you at the end, is get connected with the financial aid professionals in the respective schools to which you're applying. Especially if you have individual information, special circumstances. For the higher price institutions, the money, most of the money, and you're here to talk about money and learn about money, rests with the control and decision making of the financial aid offices. So get to know them, introduce yourselves to them, communicate with them directly. Don't be afraid to do that. They're a terrific resource. So that said, I have a slide talking about the topics tonight. We're going to talk about types and sources of financial aid. We're going to review the process. I'm going to talk a good bit about how decisions are made. And for me, I don't want to say that's the most important piece, that all of this is important, but understanding how the decisions are made is where I can help you most, because it's where my experience is a little unique or different than other resources that are available, right? So you can get sources, you can review the process. Understanding how the decisions are made is mysterious for families. And there's always going to be an element of mystery because different institutions make decisions in different ways. But I'll try to talk about what some of those ways are, and the why behind those ways. So that middle bullet is where I'm going to spend a fair bit of time, and I hope where you will find the most value in the program tonight. If we have time, we're going to talk about paying for college. I'm not ignoring this, but we may only get through understanding decisions and some questions. So later go back to learning about paying for college and go back to the resources that are included in this program. MEFA takes the time to put together these resources, and they're terrific. So if I don't talk through them at the end, it's not because they're not important. It's simply I want to get to that meat about how decisions are made. So are we ready to move on? I'm seeing you shaking your heads. I'm seeing you. I see a couple of people who are into the wine, but most of you, I hope, are shaking your heads and you're ready to go. You're excited about this session. Types and sources of financial aid. What is financial aid? In a most simple way, financial aid is simply money to help students pay for college, right? The presumption is you as a family, the student, have primary responsibility for paying for college. It's a choice. You're not required to attend college. You've chosen to attend college. You, in the end, will get to choose which college to attend. And so Financial aid is a collection of resources that help you pay for that, right? We could classify them under three broad types: grants and scholarships, or gift aid, federal work study, and federal student loans. So the first type, grants and scholarships, right? The free stuff. You don't have to work for them unlike work study, which you do have to work in order to earn the money, or unlike student loans, you don't have to pay them back. Grants and scholarships are gift aid. That's why the term is included on the slide here. You do have to work indirectly in the sense that students very often have to meet satisfactory academic requirements. They have to keep certain grades in order to keep grants and scholarships and so on. But for the most part, that's the best type of financial aid, the most desirous, the aid that most of us want. And we're going to come back and walk through all of these categories, but I'm going to quickly talk about sources of financial aid. So we talked about three broad categories: gift aids, grants and scholarships, work study, loans. They primarily come from four broad sources: the federal government, state governments, and we're presuming tonight Massachusetts residents, so we're referring to Massachusetts, but New Hampshire has funds, and many states across the country have funding available for residents. The colleges and universities themselves, and other agencies. And other agencies is a huge umbrella term. That may include local agencies like your Kiwanis Club and the Lions Club and your local library. It can mean national agencies, the Gates Foundation. Large corporations offer financial aid. Some of your employers may offer financial aid or programs for sons of daughters, or your sons or daughters may work for places that offer financial aid. But for the most part tonight, we're talking about the process for federal aid, state aid, and colleges and universities, right? That's our focus for the evening primarily. Under the category of federal aid, we'll stick in this slide for a moment. Federal aid might include grants, work study, loans. So we talked about the three categories earlier. So all of those categories of aid may come from the government. Grants in the form of Pell Grant, for example, or the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. Grants under the federal system are primarily for lower income families. Higher need families is another way to put that. Work study is more widely available, and loans are pretty universally available through the federal system. We have tax incentives here, just as a reminder. While I'm not going to be talking in particular about tax incentives tonight, the federal government and Congress considers tax incentives a form of aid. And when they budget financial aid, they weigh what they've spent or potentially spend in tax incentives against what they might potentially spend in the Pell Grant and subsidizing loans and so on. So that's just sort of a political context in case it matters to some of you. In the case of Massachusetts, there are also grants and scholarships and loans available. And colleges and universities are the third category here. And while I don't know the mix of schools to which you're applying, if you're applying for private institutions, and especially private institutions up in this area, in the Northeast and New England, private colleges are very expensive. If you don't know this already, most of you know it. If you don't know it, you've heard it, or you suspect it. Private universities in the Northeast and New England are very expensive. In turn, however, it means that for an individual institution, that's where most of the money is coming from. So for families who have moderate or high need, they need a lot of money to help support college. If they're attending a more expensive college or university, the bulk of the funding for that family is going to come from that college or university. So it may still come from the federal government, it may come from the state, but the majority for needy families is going to be coming from that college or university. There's a lesson here. As we talk more about this process, I'm going to talk about a federal process, but I'm going to talk about the way that private colleges and universities look at your eligibility and examine students for financial aid. That's some of the mystery that I alluded to earlier and that I'm trying to reduce for families. And other agencies, I talked about that a moment ago. Don't ignore or minimize the value of applying for aid with other agencies. You've heard rumors and stories you've heard from people who say, well, you apply for outside scholarships, it may impact your financial aid. Is that true? Sure. How it might impact can vary from school to school. Later in this session tonight, I'm going to give you specific examples, and I'm going to make an argument for making sure that you still apply for outside scholarships. So ignore some of those stories, ignore some of those rumors. On that topic, I talked earlier about taking advantage of the experts. I mentioned your school counselors, I mentioned MEFA, I mentioned financial aid offices. I conspicuously did not mention your neighbors. I did not refer to your neighbors as financial aid resources or financial aid experts. I conspicuously did not refer to your in-laws as financial aid experts. I love to tell people about my family. My wife is from a very large family, many of them females, and so I have a number of brothers-in-law. None of my brothers-in-law work in the financial aid business. They are all financial aid experts. According to them, they are experts. And when they corner me at family functions and holidays, they act like they are financial aid experts. I'm telling you to ignore those experts, ignore the in-laws, ignore the neighbors, ignore all the myths and all the stories, and rely on the factual information that you get from the experts. Okay, enough of my lessons. Let's break down the aid a little bit further so that you know more detail about some of the aid that's available. Federal direct student loans. This is a form of financial aid from the government. Some of you are immediately saying, Slattery, why are you starting with loans? Loans aren't really financial aid. If I have to pay them back, that's not really aid. I like grants and scholarships. Of course, we all do. But loans are a reality. And for the federal government, if you look at the bullets, you're seeing student as the sole borrower, no credit check, 2.75 interest rate for 2021, and repayment not due until after graduation. That's why the government considers these financial aid. They are subsidizing this. They are guaranteeing these loans. They are making low interest rate loans available to 18-year-olds without a cosigner, without any kind of credit history, and that's why they consider it financial aid. Now, do you need to be concerned about amount of borrowing? Sure. If you begin to explore student loans, or your sons or daughters explore student loans, you should be planning ahead. You should think about whether you're going to need 2 years worth of loans for a 2-year college, whether you'll need 4 years worth of loans for a bachelor's degree. For students who are thinking about pursuing graduate study, the loans don't stop. So you might end up with 5 and 6 and 9 years worth of borrowing. So loans come with some planning, the obligation to try to limit the amount of borrowing, but some moderate borrowing, some moderate amount of borrowing, I think you could consider safe. I could tell you in my personal case, I let my son take some student loans. It allows him to have some skin in the game, but my intent is to make sure that he limits that and is also smart about what he borrows, that he borrows better programs. So in that regard, federal direct student loans, which we're referring to here, are typically have better terms and better rates and are better overall options than private loans and other options available on the market. So when you're thinking about borrowing, these may be your first option. I'm talking about them tonight because they are a reality part of financial aid packages, and we're talking about financial aid packages in the financial aid process, right? Merit-based aid. So this is under that first category, gift aid, that we talked about earlier, grants and scholarships. Merit-based aid is just as the name implies, based on some merit, which can be a broad category. Some people presume merit aid is scholarship based on academics, and that commonly is the case. But some institutions offer a scholarship to the fantastic tuba player who may be playing in the marching band. Division I and Division II athletics, institutions with Division I and Division II athletics often offer athletic scholarships. That could be broadly considered a form of merit-based aid. Some institutions offer merit-based aid for artistic merit. So it's not exclusively academics. The point is it's based on something other than need or financial circumstances. In some cases, those awards may be renewable. They may be 1-year awards, or they may be 2, 3, 4-year awards. Not every college offers merit aid. Some colleges are very strict about not offering merit aid and only offering need-based aid. That's something to investigate from college to college. Some colleges will require a separate application for merit-based aid. I'll come back to that and refer to that a little bit in a few moments. And for some colleges, the application deadline may be different than the general aid process or the general admission process. So all things to be watchful over, things to explore with individual institutions. Need-based aid, as the name implies, is based on a family's financial eligibility. And much of tonight then is zeroing in on this process, right? So while merit-based aid, it's important, it's desirable, merit-based aid may get included in some of the packages we're talking about. The process we're talking about this evening is the need-based financial aid process, okay? So that may include grants, it may include loans, as I already talked about, and it may include work study. In the case of work study, we're referring to primarily the federal work study program, which is a program where the federal government provides individual colleges with funds for students to work. So the fund is only as good as the student applying for and securing a job. The fund is only as good as the student showing up to work and performing work duties appropriately. And then the reward comes in the form of a paycheck. So what else does that mean about federal work study? That for your purposes, later down the road when you start looking at financial aid awards, and when I talk to you about working through financial aid awards and examining financial aid awards, work study is not a fund that you will mentally subtract from a bill to determine how much you're going to pay, because work study will typically be paid directly to the student. Now, students can choose to apply that to an account, to his or her bill, but typically that's going to be used for personal expenses, for books, in some cases for beer and other nefarious kinds of things, but hopefully for personal expenses and books and sensible expenses. But typically it does not get applied to reduce the bill, okay? Most financial aid is need-based in this bullet point, and I talked earlier about satisfactory academic progress. In order to keep financial aid and keep getting financial aid each year, most students need to get certain grades and keep those grades in order to keep getting the money. So we've given you an overview of the types of aid, a breakdown of types of aid. What's the process? How do we get this stuff? Okay, you're anxious now. You've finished the first glass of wine and you're on the second glass of wine. You're anxious. How do we get this money, Slattery? What do we do? Throughout this whole process, be very conscious of financial aid deadlines. Financial aid deadlines will vary from college to college. This is a pain. Do not presume that they are the same from college to college. Presume that a college's financial aid deadlines will override other deadlines. What do I mean by that? If you look at the fine print on some of the financial aid forms, you'll see deadlines for certain federal funds. You may see deadlines for certain state funds, but very often a college's deadline will precede those deadlines, and that's what you should adhere to. So my quick suggestion on this is you start to collect the names of colleges to which you're applying. You start to collect admission deadline information, check all the financial aid deadline information, find the college with the earliest deadlines, and that becomes your personal deadline, right? The one college with the earliest deadlines, provided you've submitted and completed your forms by that earliest deadline, then you're going to be fine for the rest. But to get you thinking about this, for students who are thinking about early action, early decision, and hopefully you know this now, if you're in senior year and you're thinking of early action, early decision, those deadlines are in November. Some are even in October, but most are in November. Standard financial aid deadlines are very often in February or March, but many are also in January. For the private institutions, many for regular decision are as early as January, many as early as January 1st. It's around the corner. I don't know if we can emphasize this anymore. We've both bolded, capitalized, and underlined. Don't submit applications late. It sounds silly. It sounds like basic advice. But here's what's going to happen. Despite all my recommendations, you're going to listen to the neighbor, or you're going to listen to the in-law, who's going to tell you the story about, it's a personal story, or it's someone they worked with, or a friend of theirs who applied on time, but some of the applications were incomplete, or some information was incomplete. And because the information was incomplete, they didn't get financial aid, or it hurt them and they got less financial aid, or some kind of crazy story. Here's the flip of applying late. You could put together your information, have perfect information, assemble all that information, assemble it after the deadline, but you've followed the recommendation of your in-law who said, make sure all of your information is perfect. And you can send it in late. But if that college or institution has limited funding and they've spent their funding when you apply late, you have a very perfect application that may demonstrate that you have very high eligibility and need for financial aid, but there are no funds available. Conversely, if you apply on time, most colleges will treat you as an on-time applicant, even if they need more information beyond the deadline. So they will say, you've done your part, you've completed your commitment, you've applied on time, that's what's important to me, and we can get information following that. So I beat that to death, but that was the intent, apply on time. All of you, anyone applying for financial aid, to any college or university nationally, any type of college or university will be completing the Fafsa. Every college and university requires the Fafsa. To qualify for any federal aid, you need the Fafsa. To qualify for most state aid, including Massachusetts aid, you need the Fafsa. The Fafsa free application for federal student aid. Second bullet, required by all colleges. I just said that. That was available as early as October 1st. So tonight, if you didn't have a lot of wine and you want to go in and begin the process, you can do that this evening. When you complete the FAFSA, both the student and the parents will use something called an FSA ID. It's a little like your signature, your account with the government. For the student, that account will follow him or her throughout the student's career, and later when that student becomes a parent, potentially. If you're a parent of multiple students, your FSA ID needs to work. You need to use the same FSA ID for all of your sons and daughters, okay? But the primary points on this slide is you will all be required to complete the FAFSA. It's available now. When you need to complete that will, remember, depend on the individual institutions to which you're applying, not some national date. Many colleges will require tax information, but many of them will be able to retrieve that tax information, or for many of you, through a link with the IRS. That will be something facilitated through this process. You will complete the FAFSA every year. So it's something you'll apply now for freshman year, and you'll have to complete for every year for which you desire financial aid. What's reported on the FAFSA? There's general demographic information, everything from citizenship status for the parents, for the students. The FAFSA is one of the few documents in our lives in the federal system that requires a social security number. So if you have a social security number, you can't say, I want to keep that private, I can't include it. You need to include that. In some cases, we have non-citizen parents applying. There are specific directions on the FAFSA how to handle that. The FAFSA includes information about the student, as I said. For the parent, if the parents are married, it includes both parents. If the parents live together, married or not, it will include information. If the parents are divorced or separated, it includes information on the custodial parent. It includes information on the number in the household and the number of children in college. And there's financial information included on FAFSA. So parent and student income, student and parent assets. Assets will include things like savings, checking, investments. It will include 529 investments. It conspicuously does not include the value of your primary home. It does not include the value of any retirement assets. So by retirement assets, meaning qualified retirement assets, if you have a 401k, a 403b, you have a qualified pension, life insurance, none of those assets need to be included on the FAFSA. In fact, you should not include those on the FAFSA. In general, some families ask, can I put debt on the FAFSA? For the most part, it does not collect debt. Indirectly, it may when you report certain assets. So while you do not have to report your primary home, if you had a vacation home or rental property, you would include both the value and debt of that property in order to ascertain the equity, the net value of the property, but you would not be included debt otherwise. I told you everyone was going to include the FAFSA. What other forms may you need in order to apply for financial aid? For some private colleges, some private colleges require a second form called the profile. If you look quickly at the profile or you began the profile process after completing the FAFSA process, much of it will appear similar. The difference is the profile asks more detailed information. It asks details for multiple years. It asks for information that's not included on the FAFSA. And why might some colleges ask for profile information? It's primarily to determine eligibility for their funding. So remember earlier I said some private colleges, especially the expensive private colleges in the Northeast, have their own funding. Many of those colleges will have their own process and their own analysis in order to determine your eligibility for aid. What's happened over the past number of years, without totally boring you, is that the FAFSA process has intentionally become simpler, more streamlined for families, the vast majority of families nationally who are applying to either public colleges, two-year colleges, colleges that only use federal funds or state funds. The FAFSA is the only form needed. There's no reason to put you through an onerous, complicated, lengthy process. So that process has become streamlined. There are some private colleges and universities that say, okay, though, I'm awarding millions of dollars in financial aid. Some colleges, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that they might be awarding in a particular year. They want more information than the FAFSA provides, and they may be able to get that information from profile. So the downside is it's an additional form on top of FAFSA. The upside is, like FAFSA, you can hopefully complete profile once and the information gets sent to multiple colleges. So something I did not talk about with FAFSA, you complete the FAFSA once and your results can be sent to multiple institutions. Similar to what you did with scores, for example, for SATs or PSATs. You've administered the test and you had test results sent to multiple colleges. That's what happens with FAFSA. You could complete the FAFSA once, information is sent to multiple institutions, and the same for profile. But to put you at ease somewhat, to give you a frame of reference, while there are over 4,000 colleges and universities nationally, if you include 4 years, 2 years, publics, privates, and so on, there are roughly 300 and some odd colleges that require profile. So it's a minority of schools. It's primarily, as I said, privates, but not exclusively. Primarily more selective institutions, but not exclusively. Primarily more expensive institutions, but not exclusively. That gives you some kind of frame of reference. Now, Some colleges may also have their own financial aid application. So they may require you to complete the Fafsa in their own application for financial aid. That's the bottom bullet on this particular slide. So be watchful of that. Remember, I suggested earlier that you check from institution to institution. You want to check their deadlines. You also want to check their application requirements. What do they need? They all need Fafsa. Do they also need profile? Do they also need a college financial aid application? There are some colleges that require all three. They ask for Fafsa, profile, and an institutional application. That's rare. I assure you, thankfully, it's rare. And it's even rare that colleges have their own application. Most colleges, if they want additional information, more detailed information, they participate in the profile process. The hope is you have one extra form and that's it, and they've limited it to that one extra form. What else can I tell you about profile? Unlike the FAFSA that has free in the name, there's no free in the profile name, so there is a processing fee. If you're a lower income family or you're worried about paying for profile, there are waivers available. There are questions on the profile that will initially walk you through some selection information to determine if you can get a waiver automatically. And if you can't, you should be talking to your high school counselor or the college itself. Non-custodial parents will be included in the profile process, unlike the FAFSA process. A few moments ago, I mentioned that in the case of FAFSA, it's custodial parent only, or both parents, but if parents are divorced or separated, custodial only. In the case of profile, non-custodial parents are also required to submit information. Behind the scenes, it's a separate profile. It's done not to complicate the process, but to ensure privacy and separation of information for the custodial and non-custodial parent. So if that's a concern, you can be put at ease. Those processes are separated and they're very confidential and very secure. So colleges will receive information from both parents, but neither parent will have access to the other parent's information. So what happens with these forms? We've now talked about FAFSA, we've talked about profile. You complete these forms, they're available online, you can complete them online. There are tools that you can download to either practice or identify the information that you need in order to complete them online. In both cases, you can begin the process online, step away and go back to it. In some cases, you might get to a question where you need more detail or you need documentation that you don't have available. You could go back into the process. But briefly, and I'm oversimplifying, but that's the intent for the moment. You submit these forms online. The information is processed by a processor, by a contractor, who then sends results from that information to individual schools. So each form, different process, but they work in a similar way. Calculations are done upon the information that you've submitted. Results from those calculations are sent to individual schools. In some cases, you may need other information. Many colleges may require tax information. Some colleges will require tax information only for certain families. In some cases, you may have special circumstances and want to provide other information directly to the college. That's okay. But for the most part, this information is going to be sent to individual colleges. They now work with this information in order to determine your eligibility for financial aid. I'm touching briefly on a process called verification. I just mentioned that some colleges will ask you to submit tax documents. Some colleges will ask for their own purposes. They may require it for all incoming freshmen. They may require tax information for all students. They may require it for only certain students. But nationally, there's a process through the Department of Education called verification, where a college is required to verify your information. In some cases, perhaps using tax returns. In some cases, just using some extra worksheets that you will complete. If you're selected for this process, it's nothing to fear. It's not a negative thing. It's not a negative view of your application. I just want you to be prepared for it. Yeah, it's a straightforward process. It's something where you follow instructions and just follow up with the information that the college asks of you, but you may be required to do verification even for public colleges or universities. Again, however, not an onerous process and not something to fear. It's merely a way that colleges are required to confirm and cross-check information for the government, which is contributing billions of dollars to this process. Now, some of you know you've either participated in this process or you suspect. I've talked a lot about forms. I've talked about something like the Fafsa, where millions and millions of applications are processed each year. Even Profile, even if a smaller number of institutions use Profile, you can imagine at larger institutions, mine is included, Northeastern, Boston University, Boston College, annually receive tens of thousands of applications for admission, and they include then tens of thousands of applications for financial aid. So you can imagine then it's a little bit of a bureaucratic process. It's a standardized process. Most of you don't come from standardized families, and there might be special or unique circumstances, and that's okay. If there are special circumstances, if you think there have been a change in circumstances since you applied, if you have unique information that you just had no way to include on these forms, get in touch with the financial aid office. Get in touch with them personally. They can talk to you about special circumstances, information that they might require. They can talk to you about whether or not they have an appeals process for special circumstances, the kinds of special circumstances that they may consider and that they may not consider, and so on. But in these cases, my best suggestion to you is to be in touch directly with the colleges and universities themselves. Okay, we're doing not too bad, 7:15. Let's talk about how decisions are made. Colleges begin, think of this now as chunks in a process. And so I'm going to walk through this slide. We're going to treat this slide uniquely, the next slide uniquely, and then we're going to combine this information. So bear with me and know that later you can review this and you can look at this again. A lot of this will come at you fast. Some of these slides are dense. You see a bunch of terminology and plus signs on this slide. This slide is simply trying to convey the concept that colleges, in order to determine eligibility for financial aid, begin with a thing called cost of attendance. So cost of attendance includes obvious things, billed items, tuition and fees, the first box. Makes sense, right? Every college, you'll pay tuition, they will have an expectation for tuition. They may have fees associated with either anything from a major to general fees to students who live on campus and so on. If you live on campus at the particular college, there are fees for room and board. So these both items are blue. They're blue because blue is considered direct costs or direct expenses or expenses that the university bills. But you'll also have other costs that you don't necessarily pay the university, but you still absorb over the course of the year. Books and supplies, these are the items that are in gold. Books and supplies, transportation, personal expenses, transportation, the cost of you're attending college in California. You have an expense to incur to get to California and return home, and perhaps multiple times a year. Even if you attend college locally, but perhaps you're not living on campus, then you might have different kinds of transportation expenses. So you can include those or consider that they're part of your cost of attendance, but you're not necessarily paying them to the institution. Conceptually, I'm trying to separate here the difference between the analysis for your eligibility for financial aid and then the billing process, which is going to come later, and it's going to be a different process. The other thing that's happening, I'm hoping conceptually, is that you're starting to see a split between what a college might cost and how your eligibility for financial aid is analyzed, and then what your true costs are in the end. We'll give you examples of that. If that doesn't make sense quite now, and it sounds mysterious, you'll get specific examples in a moment, okay? So think of this one slide on its own, cost of attendance. A college begins with this to determine eligibility for financial aid. In most cases, they will use standardized kinds of numbers. So room and board, for example, they will use a standard room and board cost. It might not be your individual cost, which could be more or less. And similarly, your books and supplies might vary from your neighbor's books and supplies, but the college is going to begin with standard numbers here in order to determine eligibility for aid. These famous forms that they talked about, that I alluded to, are now then going to determine a calculation called expected family contribution. I hate the terminology. The terminology is misleading. Expected family contribution makes it sound like the amount that you'll write in the form of a check or some kind of payment to the college or university, right? College says you're expected to pay X and that's what you pay. Expected family contribution for our purposes for this evening is what is being used by the colleges to determine your eligibility for financial aid. I would let it stay at that. You want to understand it conceptually, but you don't want to confuse it with what you might have to pay in a bill. The other piece I should add here is that I've already told you there's Fafsa, the free application for federal student aid. There may be a second form called Profile. Private institutions may use Profile. Private institutions may use information on Profile that's not on Fafsa. And that's because private institutions very often are coming up with a different family contribution than the one for the Fafsa. Now for Fafsa, for federal aid, state aid, they have to use the same calculation, the same information. There are very set rules about processing that information and determining a calculation. But for institutional dollars, you're a private institution, in a sense you can have your own rules for distributing your own funds, right? So there's a little bit of a separation now. Again, in several slides, you're going to see more distinct examples of how this works. But conceptually, for the families who are thinking about private colleges, you need to understand this or have some sense of the fact that there will be two processes behind the scenes, okay? I can't repeat enough the fifth bullet down, not necessarily what the family will pay. This is really to determine your eligibility for financial aid only. There are some references at the bottom of ESC calculators. If you're interested in broadly or high level understanding what your contribution might be, if you're parents of a junior, for example, or a sophomore in the audience, so you're a year away from this process, you can use calculators to help you get an idea of what your eligibility might be. If you're not going to apply until the regular decision process in the spring, the calculators can do the same things for you. If you're thinking about early decision or early action, you're here. So calculators may not be super helpful at this point, but if you'd like to get some kind of estimate of what your eligibility might be, either using at the federal level or for particular institutions, there are calculators at MEFA. There's information at IFAP, the other link here, and all colleges and universities are required to have calculators as well. And most of those, if they're a private college or university, will have something that's tailored to their own eligibility and their own funding. And so it gives you information more distinct to that particular institution. So these can be valuable. They can't be relied on with absolute certainty. While they can be valuable, do not overuse these. If you are a family of divorced or separated parents, these calculators are less useful because your situation's more complicated. If you're a business owner, or you earn income through sales, where your income can vary from year to year, these calculators are less helpful, but they can be helpful in many cases, and it's why we have a reference here. Okay, pause for a second. I'm looking at you again. Shake your heads. You still with me? Shake your heads. I see the attendee count on. We've held on to the attendees, although some of them may be sleeping. That's why they're still online.
And Jim, I can tell you that there are lots of great questions, so people are not sleeping. People are very engaged here. So, but keep going, and we'll get to all of them at the end. I'm answering a few on the side.
Thank you. So this is the place to pause because this is the calculus now for which the meat of what we're going to talk about the next few moments and really till the end of the session. This is the meat of the session. So I just explained to you how cost of attendance is calculated, how it's determined, and why it's determined. Expected contribution, and the difference is your eligibility for financial aid. It's only that. So we've talked a lot about philosophy, we've talked a lot about process, we've talked a lot about forms, and at this point we've only gotten to eligibility. We don't have any cash for you yet. We don't have any money. We only have eligibility. But conceptually, it's important to understand this. Conceptually, remember I told you that there's federal process, FAFSA form, federal rules, and many private institutions may have their own rules through a private process, through profile or an institutional form. So behind the scenes, there may be two of these calculations happening. One, cost of attendance, an expected family contribution for the federal level, and an expected family contribution from an institutional level. So private institutions may be determining your eligibility for federal funds, but they're also determining eligibility for institutional funds. In the end, the financial aid offer that they will extend to you will include all of this. So you don't have to worry about getting two offers. You don't have to worry about getting two different streams of information. But I want you to know what's happening behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, there may be two different streams of analysis happening for private institutions. For the publics, for the 2 years, don't worry about the nonsense I'm talking about. But for those of you looking at expensive privates, it's important, and that distinction is important. Okay. Let's give you a real world example now. So we have a particular college. We've said the cost of attendance is $45,000. We've said then that the family contribution is $5,000. Now, in theory, in a perfect world, your contribution is $5,000. The intent then, the difference, the 45 minus the 5, is your eligibility for financial aid, right? So cost of attendance 45, family contribution 5. The difference is eligibility for aid, $40,000. In a perfect world, if all colleges had unlimited funding, if the federal government had unlimited funding, states had unlimited funding, this means then that you would receive $40,000 from all the $45,000 colleges, and you have equal choice among the colleges. So I'm going to show you how aid gets awarded in one example, and then I'm going to show you multiple examples comparing multiple colleges. But at this point, let's stick with the primary example. Cost of attendance $45,000, family contribution $5,000. The college now has all this information. The college's job is to put together a financial aid offer, a package. And it's a college's job, it's not your worry now to worry about the little federal funds available and state funds available. The college will figure that out. So the college will say behind the scenes, let me see what's available to you. In this case, because we're looking at a more expensive college, $45,000, and there's only so much federal and state aid to go around, we're going to offer you some of our own money. And in this case, we're looking at Mary, and Mary's a smart student, so we're offering her a scholarship of $10,000. But Mary's family, your family, we're looking at you, has additional eligibility. So we're also going to offer some need-based grant in the amount of $17,500. So both are institutional funds. The scholarship is based on academics. The grant is based on need. But in total, they're applying the same way. It's gift aid. Remember our reference to gift aid earlier. And they're both going toward that eligibility of $40,000. The government also says, the college says the government's making Stafford Loan available of $5,500. We talked about that earlier. It's still a good option for students. So they're going to offer $5,500 through the federal subsidized Stafford Loan program. And this college believes that all students should participate on campus and pay some of their own way and pay for personal expenses. So they've offered a work-study award of $2,000. Now remember that $2,000, if later you're calculating the bill, You don't want to deduct that $2,000 because that isn't realized until the student works. You can safely deduct the $5,500, the $17,500, the $10,000. Now, I don't have a side calculator on this, but together the 10, the 17,500, the 55, and the 2,000, that's 35,000 in aid. Okay, so in the example we're choosing example where college, again, now sorry, I'm going to back up and repeat this. College A, $45,000, contribution 5, so the eligibility is 40. The college is offered 27.5 plus 55 plus 2. Now the college is offered $35,000. $35,000 is the financial aid award. That's the package. But the eligibility was 40. Family contribution was 5. So there's a mysterious 5,000 floating out there. In this case, I'm going to call it unmet need. Some colleges, or you may see reference or writing about this, called a gap. You can call it whatever you want. In the end, this becomes family contribution, right? We've said that the college is going to cost roughly $45,000 and that the aid is roughly $35,000. The difference is owed by the family regardless. So bringing up this point because we talked about a process that determines eligibility, but eligibility is only as good, eligibility is merely a concept until the aid comes into play. And in the end, your job or your work in the end will be evaluating financial aid offers from multiple institutions that might have better or worse resources, or that may look at your son or daughter differently than one another. And I'm going to give examples of that in a second, in order to make your best financial decision. Okay. Net price calculators, I forgot that I had this slide here. I already talked about those, so I'm going to skip over that now. And I'm going to give you examples of award letters. So remember I said conceptually, in a beautiful world, we have cost of attendance of $45,000, family contribution of 5, so eligibility of 40. And we have 3 colleges who all did the same calculation. Now remember, I already told you some colleges will do a different calculation for institutional funds. But let's just say these 3 colleges all calculated your information the same. They all came up with a family contribution of $5,000. They all came up with an eligibility of $40,000. But College A has offered $32,500 in grants and scholarships, College B $25,500, and College C $17,500. They've all offered the same $5,500 in student loans. They've all offered the same $2,000 in federal work study. So you can see the totals are very different because of the difference in grants and scholarships. Now, why might these be different? A variety of reasons. College C may simply be not as resourced as College A. College C is acknowledging your eligibility. They're acknowledging that you might have the need of $40,000, but they simply don't have the funding to give you. It may be that College C has the funding, but College C has decided, and this hurts for families, your son or daughter isn't as desirous as another student. So it might be that these are the same college, and really College A is person A, College B is person C, right? So college has said, this student is a straight A student, and this student is a superstar at my institution. And so I'm going to offer more money. I'm going to offer $32,500. And this student with the same need or eligibility, I may not offer the same funds. That sounds crass, it sounds disappointing, but it's what may happen with individual institutions. So there may be a variety of reasons. You don't know the reasoning. It may have to do with the student. It may have to do with funding at the institution. It may have to do with their resources. There are different reasons, but the same analysis, same calculation may yield 3 very different financial aid packages. Here's a case where we again have the same calculation. And if you look quickly, you go right to totals, the financial aid packages are the same, $35,000. But if you look at the mix, College A offered 27.5 in grant and scholarships, loans, work study, and that gave you the $35,000. College B offered only 17.5 in grant and scholarship, the same student loans, the same work study, but they're saying the parents could take out a loan of $10,000. And while it's true that you can take out a loan of $10,000, for all practical purposes in that example, that has become your contribution, additional contribution. For all practical purposes, this offer for College B is $25,000, correct? And over here, this offer is essentially $5,500. They've offered you, I'm sorry, is 23,000. Sorry, I hit the wrong slide in front of me. This offer is the 5,500 loans. College C, the rest is contribution for all practical purposes. So be careful about these award letters. You're not only looking at the richness of the overall difference in financial aid, but even when financial aid appears to be the same, you want to look at the mix. And richer packages obviously have a richer mix of grant and scholarship so that your end out-of-pocket cost is less. So I'll review this again. This is difficult when I'm doing this remotely. I'm not seeing your faces and we're not interacting. But the brief is, we've talked about a process, forms in a process that determine your eligibility for financial aid. The eligibility is a theory until the colleges start offering financial aid. And because colleges may be resourced differently, have different priorities, have different goals, those financial aid packages can vary quite a bit based on the very same information. And remember now I layered in the fact that they may look at the information differently. So now you add in another layer here where these contributions may not all be the same. And that could vary from school to school. So I urge you, you go through the process. There's a little bit of a leap of faith in the process. There's trust that the colleges are treating you well, and they will. Remember to give them as much information as you can. But in the end, your job is to look at bottom line, what the out-of-pocket cost will be based on the cost of that institution, less the real dollars you're getting. Not eligibility, not an EFC number, but the real dollars that you'll be getting from those individual colleges. Okay, paying for college. I wish we could pause. Julie, I don't know if you have any questions now. You want to stop me? If not, I'll go into the next sections and we could do some questions at the end.
Well, we have a couple that I think are all about the application process and how colleges treat some of these things. So maybe I will ask you a couple of questions. And of course, they're the tough ones because you really covered everything so thoroughly, but I have a couple of tough ones. So can you talk a little bit about irrevocable trusts and how those are treated on the FAFSA and the CSS profile? And this person said that student and sister are beneficiaries of a trust and the trustee has control.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
So Julie wasn't kidding when she said these are difficult questions, but I'm going to give for the individual who asked this might be a disappointing answer, but I'm hoping my general answer is it can actually answer other questions and it has implications in the answer. You know, colleges, there's an adage among financial aid people, and there's an adage in the government that says, you know, this process in a pure sense, that there simply isn't enough money to go around, right? If we look collectively at the resources available for financial aid and what financial aid costs and what families truly need, if we had this perfect way to identify what families need, and I will answer the trust question in a second, but if we look at what families need, there aren't enough resources, monetary resources available for parents. So for colleges, it becomes one, to some extent, for the government, if this is really the only extent, it becomes an extent of trying to distribute funds fairly and equitably. And for colleges, they try to do the same. Now, there's also some self-interest for colleges. I alluded to that a moment ago, that some colleges may be willing to spend more money on a more desirable student. So there's some self-interest. But for the most part, they're looking within that self-interest, they're looking to apply information and make decisions in an equitable and in a fair way. Okay. Now, that said, the old adage that I started to mention earlier was this process then measures ability to pay and not willingness to pay. And so, for example, we deal with that through non-custodial parents, where some families will say, you know, non-custodial parent doesn't want to be involved, hasn't agreed to pay for college. But if that parent is still providing resources for the child or for the former family and so on, the college is saying, not my decision. I'm still going to use that in my analysis. I can't tell you how to pay for college, but I'm going to use that in my analysis. So the same thing for trusts. Many colleges will say, if there is a trust in a student's name, while the mechanism might have been irrevocable, or the mechanism might have been where there's a trustee that has that information and the student does not have the information, the college's position is that that's an asset of the student. Now, will they treat it the very same way they might treat cash in the bank or other assets? Perhaps not. Very often there might be a trust set up for a certain reason, and depending on the reason, colleges may take that reason into play and take that into consideration. So a trust might have been set up for medical expenses, unusual medical expenses. It might have been set up because of a ill parent or a parent that's deceased. And so those special circumstances may be taken into play on behalf of the institution. But in general, if a trust is set up because the hope was, by setting up a trust and saying that the information in the trust is only available to a family member or neutral party and not available to the student, but yet the corpus, the assets in the trust are available to the student, most private colleges and institutions are going to say, I'm going to use that information in my evaluation because it's still an asset for the student. And now I'll drag it out a little bit because it is a complex question. It's a great question. Some families then might argue, but it's not going to be available until after graduation. And the college said, you're understood. I'm not saying that you necessarily have that asset available now, but I'm saying when I evaluate you, you will be in a better position upon graduation than your, say, neighbor, all other factors equal. So this gets into that relative evaluation I referred to, where colleges might say, all things equal, what makes you different or better off or worse off than a neighbor? And in this case, I think most colleges will make the argument that that student, even if they have to wait for the assets or the assets may come later, that student is in a better position financially than someone with all information the same, but not possessing that trust. So it's a long way of saying most colleges are still going to look at that asset and require information on that asset. And for the families that say, I still can't access that information, I hate to use the term standoff, but I've seen standoffs, and the best crass way I can put it is, in the case of private institutions, they have the money, they control the money. They may want information in order to spend that money. I don't know, Julie, your opinion, you've dealt with this before. Is that a fair enough
I think so. I
not?
think so. Yes. Yes.
You have another toughie?
Well, you know what? Maybe this could be, we can generalize this because people ask a lot of questions about how do they know the value of an asset. This one is specifically a defined benefit plan. And the person is saying, how can I, calculate, how do I know the value of it? And I think, so maybe sort of a general answer about how to estimate some of that and how to give a good answer for some of those estimated values.
Well, let me try to touch on that in multiple ways. First, if we're
Yeah.
truly talking about a defined benefit plan, I'm hoping somebody then missed one of the things I might have said earlier. In the case of Fafsa, you are not required to report retirement assets. So most likely, if we're talking about a defined benefit plan, we're talking about a retirement plan, and we're talking about a benefit that does not have to be reported for the FAFSA. Now, in some cases, this may be someone who saw the question on profile, and yes, profile may ask some questions about retirement assets. The good news, and this doesn't really address the question, but it's a related topic, is that most private colleges and institutions also do not use retirement assets as part of the calculations. Now, applicants are skeptical. If profile asks for information about a retirement plan and you've included the information, you have every reason to be suspicious and nervous that the college may be using the information on the retirement. But I can assure you, based on experience and based on working with colleagues in the field, very, 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 very few colleges look at or use retirement as part of the calculation. The ones who do use it in very limited ways, the vast, vast majority do not use retirement assets at all. So one simple part of this answer may be, you may be getting wound up or concerned about something that may not matter in the end. Now, that said, there are still general questions about even home value. How do you determine home value? The instructions will tell you it's market value. It's not tax value, but it's market value, and it's your best estimate and your best guess. And I would say the same goes for those defined benefit plans. Most HR operations, while they won't give you a specific dollar, they won't be able to pinpoint a dollar. They should be able to give you some kind of broad estimate of a value or a range of values for a defined benefit plan. I know that's sort of a vague answer because in many cases there is no definitive answer for that. Colleges are looking for your best guess, your best effort, your best honest effort in those cases. And again, I'll circle back and say, in most cases, it's going to be a moot point because it's not going to be used in the analysis anyhow.
Jim, that's great. Thank you. And I think you can keep going, and then I'll have a few more for you.
Okay. I'm wondering, the family, I know that we had Wilmington. I have to give a shout out to Wilmington because I heard from one of the school counselors there. So I don't know whether some of the Wilmington families are out there trying to stump me tonight. If so, they might have done a good job. Let's talk a little bit about thinking after the award letter. So remember, I said, once again, to review and beat things up a little bit more, we went from concept of determining eligibility. Then we have a way to determine eligibility, which may vary from school to school, and it may vary for privates, for an institution's information versus public and state funds. Now you've made a decision about an institution. You have an idea of what the out-of-pocket costs are, but now you have to look at ways to pay for it. Now, the philosophy, which I didn't talk about a lot, but part of the reason I don't like and my colleagues don't like family contribution is because behind the scenes, these calculations are presuming that the family is able to contribute not just out of pocket, but in a sense, it's I hate using this word, and especially it's a bit of a paradox to apply it to money, to say that it's a holistic calculation, right? To say a holistic calculation is probably a bit of an oxymoron, but in a sense, colleges are saying we're looking at contribution based on the past. So the past might come in the form of savings, accumulated savings, and assets. The present comes in the form of income, and the largest part of these calculations comes from income, current expenses, based on family size, based on where you live, based on a host of other circumstances, but current availability of income. And then it's also looking into the future a bit. And it's why, for example, the FAFSA asks age of the older parent, because it's trying to project where you are in the life cycle. Are you closer to retirement and you have fewer years to earn? Or are you younger and you have many years to recoup and recover after paying for college? So all of these factors are taken into account in the calculations. And similarly, you can think of those factors in the same way when you think about ways to pay. So don't presume. Some families panic. They find out college costs X, we're receiving Y in financial aid, and so we owe the difference Z. And the panic is the difference is $10,000. I don't have $10,000. And none of us do. I know that for certain, right? Even those of us who are doing better than others, nobody has $10,000 at the end of the year cash. You don't have that kind of money. So families panic and say, I don't have $10,000. Well, the $10,000 may come from multiple resources. And that's typically the best way to pay for multiple resources. So once you get to this payment amount, don't presume there's one way to approach it. There could be multiple ways to approach it. So in this case, in this slide, we have a balance due of $20,000. It doesn't mean you have to find $20,000 in cash. We all know that you can borrow that, but it also doesn't mean that you necessarily have to borrow a full $20,000. So you might say, okay, my son or daughter had some savings from the summer, and so they have $1,000. And I have some savings. I don't have a ton. None of us do, but I could put 4,000 of that toward the bill. But I could also maybe spread out some payments through a payment plan. So this college might have a payment plan that allows me to stretch another 5,000 over 10 months. 500 a month is still a lot, but by doing 500 a month in the savings, then in the end, I'm going to borrow $10,000. And it's a much better option than borrowing the full 20,000, right? So it means I don't have, as an extreme an example of trying to come up with $20,000 in cash and liquid immediate dollars, but I'm trying to minimize borrowing, so I'm not borrowing a full $20,000. And then you can imagine every variation in between of payment plan, borrowing, savings, current income, and so on. Be thinking about these varied ways to pay instead of presuming that you approach things one way. Other kinds of conversations that may come either early in the process, later in the process, once you start looking at financial aid awards. None of these things should be off the table, no pun intended, because it says kitchen table conversations. But community college could be a great option for students. It could be a great, least expensive or less expensive option for 2 of the 4 years of college. I talked about planning earlier. I talked about thinking about debt over time and amount you might borrow not only for 1 year, but for 2 years or 4 years or 8 years. Similarly, you would be thinking about the number of children that you send to college. So I'll tell you personally, as I think about what I'm capable, what we are capable of spending for my son who's currently in college, we have to weigh that with what we may need to spend for younger siblings. Think of enrollment beyond 4 years and total debt. I talked about that earlier and just alluded to it again. As you think about that debt, then think of that debt as a conversion to some kind of payment plan post-college for both you and for the student. For the student's career, you can start to weigh salary toward potential borrowing. So I mentioned there are lots of studies that say moderate amounts of borrowing, for example, can be comfortable. There are principles and rules of thumb, just as there are rules of thumb about what a family might be able to absorb in a mortgage payment based on income. There are rules of thumb about how much student debt might make sense, even factoring in things like mortgages or rent or car payments and other kinds of expenses post-graduation. And those numbers then can be compared to intended career and salary expectations. As a student considering graduate school, we've talked about that several times. If you think you may need to explore private loans, many of the very competitive private loans, and there are tons of lenders out there, as you can imagine, just as there are tons of mortgage lenders, rely primarily on credit score. And credit score can not only vary from lender to lender what score they use, but how they use that score and how they weigh that score, and the rates that they give you and terms that they give you. The most important thing you can do, we've talked about it, and we gave you examples in those earlier slides, is comparing net price for each institution. What does this institution cost? What's the aid they're giving me? Subtracting out work study, subtracting out the baloney like parent loans that I already know I could get. What is the true financial aid that is going to reduce my bill? That is my net price, and that's how I'm going to compare college to college. I should mention here at pause, I think it's alluded to in some of the slides, but if I forget to mention them, there are tools that help you do this, and MEFA has tools that help you do this. So I could talk about it now conceptually, but MEFA has some tools that help you walk through this process. This is college A, this is their cost, this is the aid I'm getting. It keeps you on track. It allows you to compare apples to apples so that you make better comparisons. You're not making vague assumptions. Those can be helpful tools, and you should take advantage of those. Look through these resources later. These are other options: mass transfer and tuition break. I'll let you review those, and I'll let you review some of the free great resources that are available. Fafsa Day across the Commonwealth. These used to happen more locally in non-COVID times. Now they will be virtual, but these are still terrific programs. They're staffed by financial aid professionals from colleges and universities. Take advantage of centers like the EOC, Mass EdCo. They have free financial aid help. I can't say enough about MEFA, even though they are the sponsor, and Julie would threaten me if I don't talk about MEFA, but they do have terrific resources, and they have terrific people at the organization. Other than Julie, take advantage of all these resources and use these connections. Do we have other questions? I have time and the energy to answer some other questions if we have some others, or if I missed anything, Julie.
I do. And as continuing on with the theme, we have some tough ones, but we have a lot of thank yous, Jim. A lot of people are saying thank you very much. This is very helpful. Let me ask you. I'll ask you this one, Jim, because this was the first person who asked a question and also said good evening right away. So I feel like I should ask it. But if this is too, detailed and very specific to other schools, this is something that we can do a little research on at MEFA and get back to him. He's just asking if you want to talk about income share agreements at all. Do you have anything to say about that, or would you like us to do a little research and send that later?
Oh, no, I don't mind. Was it just a broad? Was it
yeah.
just?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't. I'll talk about it. It may, and I'll apologize in advance to whoever asked the question, because my answer may not be very specifically useful. but let me talk about it. Let me do my best layman's definition. Income share agreements, for those who aren't familiar with these, income share agreements are a form of a way for students to access money. I'm being careful about how I say this. The income share agreement people and organizations that provide income share agreements are very careful to say these are not loans. I would argue if an organization offers you money and you need to repay the money, that's a loan. So maybe with a small L, we can consider these loans. They act very much like loans, but there are some important differences than loans. So primarily income share agreements are essentially where an organization, a funding entity, I'm talking broadly because there are banks involved in income share agreements, but primarily they're organizations, everything from colleges and universities themselves. So Purdue University, for example, has gone whole hog and invested in doing income share agreements for its students. There are other organizations that have income share agreements that are aligned with mission. So some may have income share agreements that are intended for international students or students of certain countries or students from certain majors. So the investors, the income providers can come from all over the place. But to get back to the definition, it's a provider offers money to a student that the student in turn applies toward tuition or applies like financial aid. And the student then has a responsibility to pay back the amount that was given to the student after graduation, and the amount that the student pays is based on income, very simply, and it's a share of income. So the agreement might be, I've accepted $10,000 from you, and in return, I will give you 1% of my income for a set number of years. Now, the difference with loans is that very often, if the student is initially not earning income, is not employed, or experiences gaps in employment or loss of employment, there's no obligation to pay during that gap. Unlike a loan where the loan might be earning interest, or you might still have to make payments during a gap in income, an income share agreement relieves you of that. An income share agreement will have typically a payment deadline. So at the payment deadline, the student is done paying regardless of the amount that was paid back in the meantime. That might be another element of the income share agreement. And if a student never earns a certain income, then the student may never have an obligation. And similarly, there is typically a cap on either percent or overall dollars that the student would be responsible to pay back. Now, I want to say all of that explanation, I prefaced it with saying a layman's introduction. Even though I'm a financial aid professional, I'm not an ISA professional. But whoever asked the question may ask because they're becoming more and more common. There are more groups that I'm seeing that are making income share agreements available as alternatives to borrowing, or for students or groups of students that may not have as ready access to credit. So for example, international students are a classic population where international students very often, because they don't have the earnings history or a local co-borrower or so on to take out a traditional loan, an income share agreement could be a great alternative. For a potential borrower, a student, or a parent who has poor credit, and so certain loans are not available, or a lousy credit score, so certain loans aren't available, an income share agreement can be a great alternative for that particular family or that particular student. Beyond that, you can imagine, even with my poor explanation, there are variations based on the investor, based on student major. So for example, there would be different expectations placed on an engineering student versus an arts student. There's a better bet on certain job potential and certain income earning potential and so on, for based on major and based on job, based on the college and university the student graduated from, and so on. So that's my explanation. Beyond that, I don't really have a commentary. Whether they're available or not, the income share agreement ISA market is very often direct to consumer, so many colleges aren't involved in it. We have students at our institution who secure money through income share agreements. There are probably students at my university getting income share agreements about which I have no knowledge. Some ask for the school to provide information, but others do not. But otherwise, very often, even though they're not loans, they're processed and treated like loans for financial aid purposes. Probably more information than you needed.
No, that's great, Jim. And I guess what I'll say is I'm just going to ask one more question because it's past 8 o'clock and I'm a little bit nervous. I'm not sure exactly when the webinar will cut us off, but I'll ask one final question. And if by chance I missed any of your questions here or Jim didn't get to any, we have contact information for you. Actually, I think, Jim, it's on the next slide that people can call or write. But I will ask this last question, and hopefully you'll have a chance to answer it. But I'll just say good luck to everyone. The question is just about COVID and these crazy times that we're in. And the question is just asking, let me just see the exact way it's worded. Will COVID affect the amount of money colleges can award this year? Any insight into the way the pandemic will affect things? And so I know that's a big question, but I guess on the financial side and the money that colleges have, can you just say a few things about that maybe?
Yeah, again, this would be different if we had an audience, because I would ask for clarification, because there's sort of two ways to answer that, and that's okay. I also want to quickly, in case we get cut off, I want to thank everyone out there, and I want to wish you good luck. Some of you are close to this process, some of you may be a year or several years away, but I want to wish you all good luck and the best wishes. Please be in touch with the college people, and unlike the IRS, that some people associate this with the tax system, where the IRS, the less they know, the better off you are. The more financial aid people know, the better off you are. I promise you. Take that to heart. So let's talk about COVID.
Thanks, Jim.
Two ways. I'm going to try to answer it in two ways. One is it can impact the way colleges award, because for many individual families, it's a special circumstance, right? COVID has perhaps impacted your family in very particular ways. So it could be anything from change of employment to loss of employment to unusual childcare expenses. The whole gamut. It's many of you know, and many of you are experiencing. So in that sense, on an individual basis, it can absolutely impact the way you're awarded and what you're awarded. And in that sense, these should be cases where you're in touch with the individual colleges and universities, because they are special circumstances. Now, the other way the question might have been being asked is, because of COVID, has COVID impacted colleges at a broader level, and will that impact financial aid? And the answer is potentially. COVID, it still hasn't played out in a sense, because we're now only in October of the first full semester, where we're experiencing the impact of COVID, the impact of students studying virtually, the impact of some students not being on campus, in turn then some students not paying room and board, and how this impacts income and revenue for individual colleges and so on. And so it's unknown still, but for some colleges and universities, I can safely predict it's going to have a huge financial impact. And for some of them, then, because it will have a huge financial impact, that impact may have a severe effect on the amount of financial aid that they are able to expend, or the relationship to aid and what they charge, and so on. So if the question was more of a broad, high-level question, could it impact colleges? Yes, absolutely. To what extent, I don't know. What percentage of colleges, I don't know. It may impact colleges in other ways. We've already seen and read about layoffs with certain public universities. You'll see it with private colleges and universities near the end of this semester and into next semester. So a lot of it I can't predict, but the quick answer is yes, it could have an impact, absolutely.
So Jim, I'm glad we didn't get cut off, and I just have a chance to say thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. You had great questions, tough questions, and a lot of questions. And yeah, I know we both wish you good luck with this whole process. And Jim, you had such good advice.
Thank you all. Thank you, Julie. Thanks, Mifa.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.